Maybe it has been a long day. You are tired, but not just in your body. It's a quieter kind of weariness, the kind that lives behind the eyes. Somewhere in the soft hum of the night, you can feel it, that faint pull towards something you cannot name. A single light flickers on the wall, steady and calm. The city sleeps, but your mind drifts like a tide that has forgotten its shore. In that stillness, a question begins to form, not loud, but clear. What if nothing is missing except the part of you stopped listening to? And so the night opens, vast, slow, and patient. This is not a story about love, but about remembering, about a quiet return to the self that has always been waiting beneath the noise. He wakes to a quiet room and reaches for the day like someone lifting a familiar shield. The face that meets the mirror is composed, steady, already practiced in what it needs to be. This is the beginning of the persona. The social mask that forms where the need to be accepted touches the wish to be safe. It is not an enemy. It is the soft armor he learned to wear each morning so that the world would not bruise what is still tender inside. By noon, the armor is working. He smiles when he is tired because the role requires a brightness, and he has learned that tired faces make others uneasy. He speaks with certainty when he is unsure because the room listens more easily to certainty than to doubt. He carries himself as the dependable one, the strong one, the one who never asks for help. And the day moves forward because someone is holding it together. In the gentle hush beneath these gestures, a different rhythm keeps time, like a heartbeat behind a closed door. The persona is a tool that once protected him. It bridged the distance between who he was and what the world asked for. In school, it kept him from standing out in dangerous ways. At work, it kept him trusted. In love, it kept him pleasing. The trouble begins only when the mask forgets it is a mask. When the armor stays on after the battle is over, the skin beneath grows numb. When a rehearsed smile becomes the only smile available, the muscles of the true face fall asleep. This is how a useful arrangement slowly turns into a quiet exile from the self it was meant to shelter. Consider the small scenes that repeat. A colleague asks how things are, and he answers that everything is fine, though the weight in his chest says otherwise. A friend reaches out and he replies with strength he does not feel because he believes weakness will shift the balance of the friendship. A partner senses distance and he offers reassurance before he has even let himself notice the distance inside. None of this makes him false. It makes him human in a world that rewards performance. Yet every performance, even the kind ones, accrues a cost. At night, the cost appears as a heaviness that cannot be named, the sense that something important is present, but out of view, like a light in another room. Jung once suggested that the mask is necessary until the person beneath is strong enough to breathe without it. This is not a demand to tear anything away. It is an invitation to loosen what has become too tight. The first act of loosening is simple and quiet. He may sit with a notebook and write 3 roles he carries most often: the caretaker, the achiever, the peacemaker, and then write 1 sentence he most fears to say from beneath each role. He does not need to read these sentences to anyone. He only needs to hear them with his own ears. In that private hearing, the armor learns to open at the seams. The mask remembers that it can be set down. The person underneath begins to breathe in his own name again. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from being the person who is always fine. It is not the weariness of labor, but the kind that lives beneath every smile, steady and invisible. He has mastered the art of composure, of answering questions before they become too real, of keeping the air light so that others feel comfortable. People admire his calm, his patience, his dependability. Yet somewhere between their praise and his silence, a small truth fades. He is tired of being liked. Nietzsche once suggested that human beings trade their instincts for acceptance. They dull their wildness to fit inside the order of things. Over time, this adaptation becomes a kind of quiet servitude. The face that was once alive with expression turns to wax, perfectly shaped, but unchanging. He does not mean to deceive anyone. He only wants peace, to be safe within the warm approval of others. But peace built on performance is a peace that trembles. Beneath the politeness, a faint tension hums, the effort of keeping two selves balanced, the one that lives and the one that stays silent. Every false harmony divides the mind. The part that lives must shrink to make room for the part that pleases. The part that wants to rest must pretend it is fine. And though the world rarely notices the difference, the soul does. It begins to whisper through small discomforts, the conversations that drain rather than nourish, the laughter that feels thin, the sudden loneliness in a crowded room. He senses it most at night, when the performance ends, but the echo remains. The echo of being seen, yet not known. There is no judgment in this realization, only a gentle truth. The desire to be liked is not wrong. It is a relic of survival. As children, we learn that love followed obedience. As adults, we forget that love also follows authenticity. The self can be shaped for belonging, but if shaped too long, it forgets its own texture. To remember it, he must risk a small moment of stillness in the open. So tomorrow, or whenever the wait feels quiet enough to notice, he can choose a single moment to stop performing. Perhaps during a conversation, he will allow silence instead of a practiced smile. Perhaps when someone asks how he is, he will pause before answering, letting the truth rise at its own pace. This is not rebellion. It is the first breath after years of shallow breathing. The world may not change in that moment, but he will feel a shift, a subtle returning of warmth beneath the skin, a reminder that honesty does not separate him from others. It brings him home to himself. There comes a time when the practiced calm begins to tremble, when the rehearsed smile no longer fits the face that wears it. At first, the change is subtle, a forgotten sigh, a sudden heaviness after small talk, a quiet longing for solitude that feels both comforting and strange. This is how the persona begins to thin. It does not shatter. It erodes softly, like the edge of a candle after too many nights of burning. The exhaustion that once seemed normal starts to feel like a message. Jung believed that the soul speaks most clearly when pretense grows tired. What cannot be said aloud finds its way through dreams, through weariness, through the tears that come without reason. These are not signs of weakness. They are the body's way of remembering what the mind has silenced. In the middle of the night, he might wake from a dream he cannot name. Something about being late or lost, or endlessly searching for a door that keeps disappearing. These are the murmurs of the inner self trying to return. When the polite mask loses its polish, The truth underneath stirs like an old melody that has not been played in years. It does not demand to be heard. It simply waits for silence long enough to enter. To live beneath the surface of performance requires a different kind of courage, not the loud courage of defiance, but the quiet bravery of stillness. The world celebrates noise, movement, connection. Yet healing begins in the pause between two breaths. In that pause, the soul begins to gather itself. There is no need to search for meaning or force revelation. The only task is to stop pretending for a while, to let the quiet find its rhythm inside the body. Each evening, he might set aside 10 minutes for this. No screens, no goals, no polished version of himself. Just a chair, the sound of his own breathing, the small creak of the room settling into night. At first, the mind will resist, listing tasks, recalling voices, rehearsing tomorrow's lines. But if he stays, if he allows the stillness to hold him without demand, something begins to unfold. The shoulders soften, the breath deepens. The thoughts that once felt urgent lose their grip, and in that gradual loosening, he feels the faint presence of something real. Not a new identity, but a returning. There is a simple mantra for this moment. When you stop performing, your soul starts breathing. It does not mean abandoning kindness or silence or strength. It means offering them without disguise, without the thin film of effort that separates expression from essence. To stop performing is to allow the self to exist without commentary, to rest in its own shape, quiet and complete. The mask has not vanished. It simply knows its place again, a tool, not a prison. Beneath the politeness, what remains is not emptiness, but space. The kind of space where the soul, finally unobserved, can begin to breathe. Inside every life, there is a locked room. It stands somewhere between memory and silence, a place the mind avoids, though it passes by the door each day. Jung called it the shadow, the collection of traits and emotions we refuse to see as ours. It holds the anger we deny, in the guilt we bury, the desire we were told was too much, and the potential we never dared to live. This room is not dark because it is evil. It is dark because it has been forgotten. Every soul builds such a chamber while learning how to survive in the world, painting over its door with words like control, composure, or virtue, and convincing itself that what lies inside no longer exists. The shadow is not an intruder. It is the part of us that once held too much feeling, too much life, too much truth for the small space we were given. It carries all that the conscious mind could not hold: the jealousy, the fear, the tenderness, the wild hunger to be free. And like a child left alone, it finds ways to return. Sometimes it speaks through irritation, when we meet in others the very thing we deny in ourselves. Sometimes it whispers through exhaustion, the fatigue of always being the good one. The more we resist, the more inventive it becomes. What we push away in the light reappears in the dark, disguised as habit, reaction, or dream. He might notice this in small, unguarded moments. He dislikes people who show their weakness, yet he is always tired from being the strong one. He judges those who take up space, yet secretly envies their ease. These are not contradictions. They are signs of the closed room knocking from the inside. The shadow seeks not to expose us, but to complete us, to remind us that wholeness cannot be achieved by denial. Every rejection is a form of self-amputation, and the cost is vitality. The energy spent on suppressing what we fear could have been the energy of creation, if only we had the courage to enter the room. Entering does not mean confession to the world. It begins in private acknowledgement. One night, when the house is still, he can take a piece of paper and write a simple heading: Things I do not want others to know. Let the hand move without censoring. The list will not betray him. It will reveal him. There, between shame and honesty, lies the first key to the locked room. No one else needs to read it. The act itself opens a small window. The air moves. The dust lifts. Jung believed that what we call darkness is not the absence of light, but its depth, the dimension that gives it shape. When he stops fearing that room, he realizes it has always been part of his house, waiting to be lived in again. The courage to enter is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of returning home. There are moments when another person's presence unsettles us for reasons we cannot explain. It could be a tone of voice, a careless remark, a confidence that feels too sharp. The discomfort seems to come from them, yet it clings to us long after they leave. Jung described this as projection, the unconscious act of placing our unaccepted traits onto others, what we refuse to meet within ourselves. We begin to see everywhere else. Each irritation becomes a mirror, each conflict a reflection of a forgotten piece of our own nature. He might find himself annoyed by arrogance, believing it is pride that offends him. But beneath the irritation, there is another story. Perhaps a time when he was made to feel small, when confidence in others felt like a reminder of his own silence. Someone else might hate controlling people, not realizing that their anger hides a deeper fear. The fear of losing freedom, of being trapped again in an old dynamic they once escaped. Our strongest reactions are rarely about the present moment. They are about the past, still echoing through it. Projection is the shadow's most subtle disguise. It allows us to preserve the illusion of purity by placing what we disown into the world around us. We label another person as selfish, stubborn, or dramatic, unaware that these qualities live quietly within us, unacknowledged but active. The more extreme the judgment, the closer it points to something internal. This is why anger can be both painful and sacred. It reveals where the unconscious demands attention. When we react violently to small provocations, it is not the world attacking us. It is the unseen self trying to be seen. Jung once said that what we deny in ourselves, we encounter as fate. The people who irritate us most are not coincidences. They are messengers. They appear in our lives not to harm us, but to reflect our unfinished work. To recognize this is not to excuse others' behavior, but to reclaim our power over how we experience it. Every mirror offers a choice: to keep fighting the reflection, or to use it as light for deeper understanding. The next time anger rises, in traffic, in conversation, in the small injustices of daily life, he can pause for a single breath and ask softly, what part of me also knows this feeling? Perhaps it is pride, or fear, or longing. The answer will not arrive as a sentence, but as a sensation, a quiet recognition in the chest. That recognition is the moment projection ends and awareness begins. Each time he does this, the mirror grows clearer, less hostile. Eventually, he learns that no reflection is truly foreign. What triggers him is also what teaches him. The world outside becomes less of a battlefield, more of a dialogue, an ongoing conversation between the seen and the unseen self. Healing does not come from defeating darkness. It comes from turning toward it, softly, without the impulse to fight. The darkness within us is not an enemy to be conquered, but a landscape to be seen. When a light is switched on in a dark room, the shadows do not disappear. They simply become space, revealing corners and shapes that were always there. The same happens in the mind. The things we call flaws or fears do not vanish when we grow. They simply learn to stand beside our light, no longer hidden, no longer frightening. For years he believed that peace would come only when the darkness was gone, when the anger faded, the guilt dissolved, the grief finally slept. But the more he tried to erase them, the stronger they grew. Suppression is a kind of feeding. What we push down gathers weight in the silence beneath. Jung taught that wholeness is not the triumph of good over evil, but the integration of all that we are. The parts we exile become the guardians of our truth. They wait at the edges of awareness, patient, carrying what we have not yet been ready to face. To reject them is to remain divided. To acknowledge them is to return to ourselves. He can begin this turning not with logic, but with tenderness. One quiet evening, he might sit with a pen and a piece of paper and write a letter to the part of himself he has avoided. Perhaps it is fear, or rage, or shame. The letter does not have to be poetic. It only needs to be honest. He can begin with gratitude. Thank you for protecting me when I was not strong enough. Thank you for carrying what I could not. There is no demand for change, only recognition. What was once darkness begins to soften when seen in this way. It loses its sharpness, like a shadow easing into twilight. The mind often resists this practice, whispering that some things are better forgotten. But healing asks for visibility, not perfection. To look at one's darkness without judgment is to remember that light and shadow exist together. The sun does not fear the night. It trusts that dawn will follow. In the same way, the soul does not fear pain once it knows pain can speak. Every emotion, every regret, every forbidden wish becomes a language, one that leads us back to wholeness. The journey of turning toward the dark is not heroic. It is humble, steady, and deeply human. Each time he listens instead of suppressing, each time he breathes through discomfort instead of escaping, he reclaims a forgotten piece of himself. The light that follows is not blinding. It is gentle, enough to see by. And in that faint illumination, he realizes the truth Jung once hinted at. What we most fear in ourselves is often what we most need to love. The mantra is simple but enduring. By touching your darkness, you become whole. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to this age, not the absence of people, but the absence of presence. The world hums constantly with voices, with notifications and open windows and digital laughter that never quite reaches the body. Every pocket holds a portal. Every face glows with artificial light. And yet behind that brightness, something quiet aches. It is the paradox of modern connection. The more ways we have to reach each other, the less we seem to arrive. He walks through a city that never truly sleeps. Lights bloom on towers like stars that forgot how to fade. In crowded cafes, friends sit side by side, each speaking to someone far away. On trains, heads bow not in thought but in scroll. The hum of conversation has been replaced by the low, private rhythm of fingertips. From above, the city looks alive, but it is a restless kind of life. full of movement without meeting, sound without listening. It is a place full of eyes, but few that really see. The modern silence is not empty. It is crowded with half-formed voices and echoes. It fills the gaps between messages, the moment after laughter, the instant before sleep, when the mind remembers that it has been performing all day. Jung once wrote that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate what matters. And perhaps that is the true weight of this silence. Not that no one is near, but that the self has grown distant from its own core. The body is here, the screen glows here, but the spirit hovers somewhere else, unacknowledged. To return from that distance, one must first learn to stop reaching outward. Not forever, just long enough to hear what waits underneath. A single day is enough to begin. One day without sharing, without performing, without documenting a life that is already happening. Leave the phone behind, not as rebellion, but as invitation. Sit in a park, walk through a street, make coffee without taking a picture. Watch the hands move, feel the weight of the cup, listen to the small sounds that never make it into recordings. At first, the quiet will feel unfamiliar, almost heavy, because silence in this age has become a forgotten language. But if he stays with it long enough, he will begin to hear something softer. The pulse of his own existence steady beneath the noise. It is in this listening that presence returns. The city remains bright, the world continues to move, but he no longer feels drowned in it. The lights lose their glare and become what they always were, reflections, not replacements. He begins to notice faces again, to meet eyes, to breathe at a human pace. The loneliness does not vanish, it transforms. It becomes space instead of emptiness, stillness instead of absence. What he rediscovers is not the world, but the quiet self he had forgotten within it. Jung once called solitude the night sea journey, a descent into the depths where the conscious mind loosens its grip and the soul begins to speak in symbols instead of words. It is not a punishment, but a passage, a crossing through the unseen ocean of the self. In this dark water, the noise of the world fades, and what remains is the pulse of being, slow, steady, ancient. Every person who has ever sought meaning must at some point swim through this quiet sea. The journey cannot be rushed, for the sea moves at the pace of breath, and breath moves at the pace of truth. At first, solitude feels like emptiness. The waves of thought crash and scatter. The body fidgets against stillness, and the mind demands distraction. But beneath that restlessness lies a deeper rhythm waiting to be heard. The night sea is not hostile. It is simply vast. It asks for surrender, not control. The more he resists it, the colder it becomes. The more he listens, the more it begins to cradle him. In the darkness, shapes begin to form. Old memories rising like phosphorescent creatures, fragments of longing, forgotten dreams, small joys once overlooked. These are not intrusions. They are the language of the unconscious, rising to meet awareness like bubbles finding the surface. Solitude, when embraced, becomes the soil of creativity. It is in the absence of noise that imagination begins to bloom. Great ideas rarely appear in crowds. They arrive in silence, when the soul is no longer distracted by the need to be seen. The artist paints, the thinker writes, the wanderer listens, not to create something new, but to remember something ancient that has been living quietly inside all along. In this sense, solitude is not withdrawal, it is communion. It is the space where the individual meets the universal, where the self dissolves into something wider, like a drop realizing it belongs to the sea. Yet, the gift of solitude does not come without resistance. The modern mind, trained for constant stimulation, trembles when faced with its own depth. But the trembling is the threshold, a sign that the surface has been crossed. If he stays, if he breathes through the discomfort, the fear begins to melt into wonder. The silence that once felt empty becomes alive, filled with subtle motion like currents beneath still water. It is here that creativity awakens, not as ambition, but as conversation. Each evening, he can honor this journey in a simple act. Write down one thing he discovered about himself in the quiet. It does not need to be profound. It could be a feeling, a memory, a forgotten desire, or the realization of what no longer matters. Do not judge it, do not explain it, only record it as a witness. Over time, these fragments form a map of inner geography, proof that the sea was never barren. It was waiting. Solitude, then, is not an exile, but a return. The night sea does not take the traveler away from life. It carries him deeper into it. And somewhere beneath the calm surface, where the darkness hums softly against the heart, he understands what Jung meant. That the soul does not grow in company, but in silence, where it can hear its own tide. There is a moment, quiet and almost imperceptible, when loneliness begins to change its shape. It happens after the resistance fades, after the restless search for noise and company dissolves into a softer kind of stillness. At first, he does not notice the transformation. The world around him remains the same walls, the same muted hum of life beyond the window. Yet something within loosens. The ache of isolation turns into spaciousness. The silence that once felt like absence becomes presence. This is the first gift of being alone. When one stops fighting solitude, it stops feeling like an enemy. Jung believed that silence is not the void we fear, but the container that allows the soul to grow. Most of life is spent running from that container, filling it with sound, distraction, and the constant performance of connection. Yet the mind, left unguarded, begins to recognize that silence does not shrink us, it deepens us. It is the soil where meaning gathers, where the self can unfold without interruption. When we no longer measure our worth by how visible we are, solitude becomes the ground of authenticity. It strips away what is borrowed and returns what is true. To be alone without loneliness is to rediscover intimacy with existence itself. The quiet becomes a mirror, not reflecting faces, but revealing presence. The small rhythm of breath, the subtle weight of thought, the gentle pulse beneath the ribs. What once seemed like emptiness reveals its fullness. The warmth of one's own heartbeat, the steady patience of the air. It is not that others vanish in solitude. It is that their absence no longer defines us. In the silence, he begins to hear something ancient, a rhythm that has been beating beneath every distraction, waiting for recognition. The practice is simple, though rarely easy. Each day, he can set aside 15 minutes to sit in stillness. No music, no voices, no tasks to finish. Just the breath, rising, falling, returning. The goal is not meditation in the traditional sense, but listening. Listen to the sound of breathing, to the faint hum of the room, to the pulse in the wrist, or the echo of distant traffic. Listen until the separation between inside and outside begins to blur. In that listening, he will notice how vast silence truly is and how safe it can be. After a while, the quiet becomes familiar, almost tender. He begins to understand that solitude is not taking anything away from him. It is giving him back everything he had abandoned in the noise, his clarity, his softness, his original rhythm. What began as isolation becomes communion. What began as emptiness becomes peace. There is a simple mantra that captures this truth, one that he can whisper when the night feels too wide. Silence doesn't take from you. It returns you to yourself. And in that return, there is no loneliness left, only depth, stillness, and the gentle knowing that he was never truly alone, only waiting to be found by his own quiet company. There is a voice inside every human life that whispers the same word over and over: mine, my thoughts, my feelings, my success, my pain. It is the voice that builds identity, that traces the fragile boundaries of who we believe we are. Jung called it the ego, the structure of consciousness that organizes experience, the small but necessary center of awareness that says, I exist. Without it, there would be only chaos, the flood of instinct and dream. With it, life gains shape. Yet the same structure that keeps us standing can also become the cage that keeps us small. The ego begins as a kind of guardian. It learns to protect us from the vastness of the world by creating stories. I am this kind of person. I belong to this kind of life. These stories give coherence, but they also limit. Over time, the guardian forgets its role and begins to think it is the master. It demands recognition, control, and certainty. It fears contradiction because contradiction threatens its sense of self. Like a bird in a golden cage, it feels secure behind its definitions, unaware that the bars keeping danger away also keep freedom out. He may notice the ego most clearly in conflict. Those moments when the need to be right feels larger than the need to be kind. When silence feels unbearable because silence might suggest defeat. The voice that rises in those moments is not malice. It is defense. It guards against the old fear of being unseen, of being insignificant. Ego builds walls not from pride but from a wish to matter. And so every argument, every small insistence becomes a quiet plea for existence. See me, hear me, let me be real. But identity that depends on opposition is fragile. The more it defends, the more brittle it becomes. Nietzsche once wrote that a strong spirit knows when to let go of itself. True strength is not in holding identity tightly, but in allowing it to evolve. Ego, when mature, becomes a bridge rather than a cage, a way of crossing between the inner world and the outer, between what we feel and what we share. To reach that stage, one must first learn to see the ego in action, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Observe the tone that insists, the reaction that spikes, the quiet tightening in the chest that says, I must be right. Then ask gently, what am I protecting right now? Often the answer will not be pride, but vulnerability, a small tender part of the self that fears being dismissed. This awareness loosens the bars. The bird begins to remember its wings. There is no need to destroy the ego or to shame it. It is part of the mind's architecture. But one can learn when to open the door, when to let the wind in, when to trust that being wrong does not erase worth. The ego doesn't dissolve through force. It softens through understanding. When he learns to watch the voice that says mine without obeying it, the voice itself quiets. The cage remains, but the door stands open. What was once protection becomes perspective, and in that gentle spaciousness, he finds the freedom that was waiting all along. Control begins as protection, a way of ordering a chaotic world. It gives the mind a map, a sense of direction, a small but reassuring illusion that life can be managed if one only tries hard enough. But over time, what began as a tool turns into a demand. The need to control becomes the invisible axis around which the entire day spins. It shows itself in subtle ways, in the person who must always have the last word, in the one who cannot rest until everything is perfect, in the silence that feels unbearable, because silence means surrender. Beneath each of these patterns lies the same quiet truth, the fear that without control, the self will dissolve. He might recognize it in the urge to prove himself right long after the conversation has ended, replaying every word like a chess game that must end in victory, or in the tension that creeps in when plans change suddenly, the body stiffening as if against an invisible wind. Control offers safety, but it is a narrow kind. Safety built from resistance. The more tightly he grips, the smaller his world becomes. In that tightening, life loses its flow, and the ego begins to mistake rigidity for strength. Yet, real strength has always been the opposite. The ability to remain open, to let what is moved through without collapsing. Psychology describes control as the ego's attempt to preserve its image. Losing control feels like losing identity, as if uncertainty could erase worth. That is why people cling to certainty even when it hurts. To admit, I don't know, is to risk the small death of an image carefully constructed. But the truth is gentler than the fear. Identity is not undone by uncertainty. It is revealed through it. When the ego loosens, the deeper self, the one not built on performance or success, begins to breathe again. What the ego calls failure is often the soul's way of expanding. This realization cannot be forced. It must be felt in the body first. The next time tension rises, when plans unravel, or the voice demands to be right, he can pause and place a hand on his chest. Feel the rhythm there, steady, unbothered, indifferent to outcomes. In that simple contact, whisper softly, "It's safe to not control." The words are not a command, but a permission. With each breath, the body learns what the mind has forgotten, that safety is not built from control, but from trust. Slowly, something inside begins to shift. The world doesn't collapse when he releases his grip. It expands. The silence he once feared turns out to be spacious. The pause he avoided becomes the doorway to calm. Control was never about power. It was about fear of disappearing. Yet the paradox remains beautifully simple. When he stops clinging, he does not vanish. He becomes vast. The boundaries of the self soften, and in that openness, life begins to move again. Not under command, but in quiet harmony. There is a quiet strength that reveals itself only when one stops struggling to prove it. Nietzsche once wrote that only those who know how to let go can ever truly be strong. To surrender is not to fall. It is to release the illusion that everything depends on your will alone. The mind, trained to conquer, resists this truth. It associates surrender with weakness, with giving up, with defeat. But Jung understood surrender differently. For him, it was not collapse, but opening, the point at which the ego finally allows the soul to move through. He has spent years holding life tightly, measuring worth by how much he could control, how well he could perform, how little he could falter. It worked for time. The grip made him efficient, admired, capable. But as the seasons changed, the grip became exhausting. There is a moment when the effort to hold everything together costs more than what is being protected. That is the threshold of surrender, not the end of effort, but the beginning of flow. Imagine a river meeting a rock. The water doesn't fight. It curves, it yields, it continues. Strength lies in that fluidity, the ability to remain whole while changing shape. Yet the ego, afraid of being forgotten, clings to rigidity. It insists on perfection, control, victory. It cannot imagine worth without achievement. And so, it tightens each time the world asks for softness. It fears being seen as less, not realizing that the greatest power lies in transparency, in allowing life to pass through without resistance. Surrender, in its true form, is not passive. It is an active alignment with what already is. It means trusting that not every door must be pushed open, that some open only when we stop knocking. It asks for courage, the courage to accept imperfection, to rest without earning it, to let things unfold without decoration. In this quiet acceptance, he discovers that most of what he called failure was simply mislabeled growth. Today, he can practice surrender in a small way. Choose one thing and allow it to remain unfinished. Let the task exist without polish. Cook without measuring. Walk without checking the time. Speak without rehearsing. Perfection is not the goal. Presence is. Each time he resists the urge to fix, he opens another window in the house of the self, letting the air move through what has been stagnant. Life is not asking him to stop caring, only to stop gripping so tightly that caring becomes control. Freedom begins where the need to win ends. This is the paradox at the heart of strength. The world doesn't require constant mastery. It requires participation. To surrender is not to lose the self, but to rediscover it beyond the boundaries of effort. When he releases the need to dominate experience, he begins to experience it fully. The texture of imperfection, the rhythm of breathing, the quiet grace of simply being. In that stillness, what once felt like defeat becomes peace, and peace, in its calm simplicity, reveals itself as the truest victory of all. There are wounds that never truly disappear. They simply change their disguises. Jung once observed that what we do not make conscious returns as fate, and this is how most people meet their pain. Not once, but over and over, through different faces, different stories, the same ache beneath it all. The unconscious repeats what the conscious mind refuses to understand. It is as if life, in its quiet persistence, keeps leading us back to the same mountain, hoping that this time we will climb with our eyes open. The repetition is rarely obvious. It hides itself in attraction, in chance, in the patterns we call coincidence. A person who fears abandonment often finds themselves drawn to those who leave. Someone who fears rejection gravitates toward those who cannot offer affection. It is not self-destruction. It is an instinctive return to the scene of the original wound, an attempt to rewrite the ending. The mind whispers, maybe this time it will be different. But the heart recognizes the terrain too well. The path changes. but the summit does not. As he climbs, the same stones bruise the same skin, and the same fear breathes quietly beneath the effort. The familiar pain is a teacher disguised as habit. It is life's way of asking us to look, not at others, but at the pattern itself. The mind believes it is seeking love, stability, understanding, yet what it is truly seeking is resolution, the moment when what was broken finally feels whole. But healing cannot happen through repetition. It happens through recognition. To see the pattern is to interrupt it. To name it is to reclaim the energy once lost to it. Until then, every choice is a circle, no matter how far it seems to travel. He may feel frustrated, wondering why certain relationships keep ending the same way, why similar arguments echo through different years. But this frustration is not failure. It is the soul's way of signaling readiness. The pattern repeats until the lesson is received, and the lesson is never punishment. It is remembrance. The wound only returns because it wants to be seen by the one who carries it. One quiet evening, he can begin to trace the shape of his mountain. Take a sheet of paper and write down 3 relationships that felt most similar: romantic, familial, or otherwise. Do not focus on who was right or wrong. Look for the emotional rhythm that ties them together. What feeling always came at the end? Abandonment, disappointment, distance. That feeling is the shadow of the wound, and by naming it, he invites light into it. The point is not to analyze, but to witness. The scars will not vanish. They will remember, but remembering is no longer the same as reliving. To see the pattern is to step outside of it, to realize that the mountain was never meant to be conquered, only understood. The climb, the fall, the repetition, all of it was the psyche's long way of saying, healing is not about reaching the top, but about finally resting where you are and seeing the view with clear eyes. The mind is a remarkable survivor. It learns early that safety lies not in truth, but in familiarity. Neuroscience tells us that the brain, above all else, seeks predictability. It equates the known with survival, even when what is known brings pain. That is why people return to patterns that wound them, not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering feels familiar. The neural pathways of the past light up like old roads at night, leading the traveler back to the same emotional towns: disappointment, guilt, loneliness, because at least there, the map is clear. The brain prefers a familiar cage over an unfamiliar horizon. Emotional habits work like reflexes. They are learned through repetition, wired through experience, and reinforced through the stories we tell ourselves. Someone who grew up equating love with sacrifice may continue to overgive, mistaking exhaustion for care. Another who learned that vulnerability invites rejection may armor themselves in distance, calling it independence. Each habit feels natural, but only because it has been rehearsed for years. The body recognizes the chemical rhythm of old emotions, the rush of cortisol in conflict, the drop of dopamine after reassurance, and confuses that rhythm with safety. Pain becomes predictable, and predictability becomes peace. This is the invisible prison of emotional familiarity. The bars are made not of logic, but of pattern. The key lies in the smallest pause, the brief moment between impulse and choice. It is here, in that space, that the brain can be retrained. Awareness does not erase the past, but it interrupts its authority. When he feels the old reaction rising, the defensiveness, the withdrawal, the tightening in the throat. He can practice doing one small, radical thing. Nothing. Just pause for 3 seconds. Breathe. Observe. In those 3 seconds, the unconscious becomes conscious. The body, expecting the same outcome, hesitates. That hesitation is freedom beginning to form. Change in the brain is slow but steady. Each time he chooses differently, new connections begin to grow, like faint trails through a dense forest. The first few steps are uncertain. The mind resists, craving the comfort of the old route. But repetition makes the new path stronger. Over time, what was once unfamiliar becomes natural. The storm of emotion still arrives, but it no longer dictates direction. The pause becomes a bridge between reaction and response, between the automatic and the aware. It is not easy to leave the comfort of pain. The mind will call him back, whispering that the old way is safer, the change is risky. But growth has always required risk. The risk of stepping into new ground, of letting the unknown become the teacher. In the stillness after each pause, he will feel it, a faint spaciousness, a breath of possibility. The brain calls it rewiring. The soul calls it awakening. And in that moment of choice, small and quiet though it may be, the familiar begins to lose its power. Freedom does not begin when we escape our patterns. It begins the moment we choose something new, even while the old patterns still whisper. Most people mistake change for movement. They leave cities, jobs, or relationships, believing distance equals transformation. But what travels with them is the same unexamined rhythm of reaction. True freedom is quieter. It happens in the invisible instant between impulse and awareness, the pause where one can finally ask, "Do I want to live this again?" The psyche is a creature of habit, loyal even to what hurts. It seeks familiarity as a substitute for safety, believing that what has happened before must somehow protect it. But life is not a loop unless we refuse to see it. Each repetition is an invitation to wake up, not a punishment. The same argument, the same disappointment, the same emotional fatigue. They arrive as echoes, asking the same question until it's answered differently. Choosing differently is not about rebellion. It is about remembering that choice exists at all. Imagine a man who has spent years apologizing for existing, softening his voice, shrinking his needs, smiling through silence. One evening, he catches himself doing it again, mid-sentence, the familiar drop in tone, the automatic, "It's fine." But this time, something stills inside him. He does not scold himself or force courage. He simply pauses and lets the moment breathe. That pause, though silent, is seismic. It interrupts years of conditioning. Awareness breaks the loop. To choose differently is an act of quiet defiance against the past. It does not always look brave. Sometimes it looks like saying no when silence would have been easier. Sometimes it looks like walking away from comfort that has turned into confinement. Sometimes it looks like resting instead of proving. Each new choice weakens the roots of repetition and strengthens the muscle of consciousness. Change is not dramatic. It is deliberate. This practice does not demand perfection. It asks only for presence. Each night before sleep, he can take a piece of paper and write one question. What did I repeat today? Not as self-criticism, but as awareness. Perhaps he noticed the same defensive tone, the same avoidance, the same ache for approval. Then he writes the second question. What could I choose differently next time? No resolutions, no pressure, only recognition. The act of writing makes the unseen visible, transforming thought into possibility. The mind may resist. It would say, "This is who you are." But identity is only memory repeating itself. Awareness is what stands outside of that memory and watches. The next time an old reaction stirs, he can pause, breathe, and remember that nothing compels him to obey it. He is not bound to his first thought, his inherited fear, or his practiced apology. He can choose again. Freedom, in the end, is not a grand escape, but a gentle redirection, a single turn toward the unfamiliar. It is not about defeating the past, but ceasing to reenact it. Each small act of awareness reshapes the mind's pathways, teaching it that safety can exist beyond habit. The loops will not vanish overnight, but each conscious choice loosens their hold, one breath at a time. Awareness breaks the loop, and in that break, life begins to move differently. Slower, truer, and finally, freely. Within every person lives a quiet duality, the light of the sun and the calm of the moon, the logic that builds and the intuition that breathes. Jung called them the anima and the animus, the two inner currents that move through the soul. One seeks to act, to shape, to define. The other seeks to feel, to listen, to merge. When these two move in harmony, a person stands whole, neither ruled by emotion nor imprisoned by reason. But when they drift apart, life begins to tilt. The mind grows loud, the heart grows distant, and a subtle loneliness begins to echo within. The anima is the soul's whisper, the inner feminine that invites softness, reflection, and empathy. She teaches the art of yielding, not as surrender, but as wisdom. The animus is the spirit of motion, the inner masculine that builds, protects, and transforms ideas into form. He brings direction and clarity. When either voice dominates, imbalance follows. The one who listens too much may drown in sensitivity. The one who acts too much may forget to feel. To meet the inner marriage is to invite both to the same table, to let the moonlight rest on the forge of the sun. It is not an abstract concept, but a lived experience. Consider the moments when he silences his own needs to appear kind. That is the animus afraid of his own strength. Or the times he pushes through exhaustion, mistaking action for worth. That is the anima forgotten beneath the noise. They are not enemies, but estranged lovers, each longing to be seen. He carries both currents, yet has learned to honor only one. The journey of integration is the reunion of these long separated halves, a wedding within, quiet but sacred. Balance does not mean equality in volume, but in awareness. There will be days when the world asks for structure. The animus builds the bridge. There will be nights when silence asks for surrender. The anima opens the window. Together, they form the rhythm of a life that breathes. This harmony cannot be forced. It must be remembered. For every thought that demands control, there is a feeling waiting to be heard. For every emotion that floods the mind, there is a thought capable of guiding it back to shore. The art is in letting both speak without silencing either. A simple practice can begin the dialogue. Tonight, when the noise of the day fades, he can write down two voices. One that wants to lead, one that wants to listen. Let them speak to each other as if they were old friends meeting after years apart. The conversation may be awkward at first, logic defending, emotion trembling. But somewhere in the middle, understanding begins to form. The goal is not to choose a side, but to hear both until the tension softens. The moon and the sun do not compete, they share the same sky. Their alternation is not conflict, but rhythm. Likewise, the inner masculine and feminine were never meant to dominate one another, but to dance, to create a self that is both still and strong, feeling and clear. When these two voices stop arguing and start listening, something new emerges. A quiet center, vast and steady, where reason warms and emotion shines. In that meeting, he is no longer divided. He is whole. Jung once said that consciousness is born out of tension, the friction between opposites, the pull between desire and restraint, freedom and safety, solitude and connection. Without tension, there is no awareness, only drift. The psyche grows where opposites meet, not where one side wins. Like a string drawn between 2 points, it must be stretched just enough to sing. Too loose and there is no sound. Too tight and it snaps. Between these two lies the harmony that sustains the soul. This inner tension is not a flaw, it is the pulse of being alive. To want closeness yet crave space, to long for certainty yet feel drawn to mystery. These are not contradictions, but invitations to balance. A person who has learned to hold both can love deeply without dissolving, and stand alone without growing cold. The mind may call this confusion, but the heart knows it as truth. Every meaningful life exists between two notes that never fully resolve. A melody stretched across the silence of becoming. He remembers moments when the tension felt unbearable, when love asked for surrender, but pride held him back, when fear whispered retreat, but curiosity pulled him forward. The impulse to choose one side is strong because choosing brings relief. But real growth lies not in the choice, but in the waiting, in the space where both truths coexist. The person who can hold paradox learns a different kind of peace, not the peace of still water, but the peace of a tide that knows its rhythm. The dance of tension is everywhere, in the inhale and exhale, in day and night, in giving and receiving. It is not something to be resolved, but something to be lived. The modern mind, raised on quick answers, forgets this. It rushes to label one side right, the other wrong. But the soul does not speak in binaries. It moves in circles, in rhythms, in the quiet hum between extremes. Each conflict inside you is a dialogue between the parts of yourself that both care. Even your contradictions are forms of devotion, one protecting you, the other pushing you toward growth. When the next inner struggle arises, the voice that says, stay, and the one that says, leave, the thought that wants control, and the feeling that wants peace, he can pause. Instead of choosing, he can simply breathe, feel the chest rise and fall, the breath move in and out. Notice how the body already embodies both tension and release. The heart expands, then contracts. It holds both movements without conflict. In that small act of awareness, he learns what the psyche has known all along. That balance is not achieved through victory, but through presence. The tension will never disappear. It is the instrument through which consciousness plays its song. Each time he allows it to exist without judgment, he grows more attuned to its music. The sound is not perfect, but it is real. A reminder that every strain, every hesitation, every pause between extremes is proof that something inside is alive and listening. The string must remain taut, the breath must continue, and the dance must go on. For it is in the movement between two truths that the self discovers its voice. Perfection is a mirage, a horizon that recedes the closer you walk toward it. Wholeness, on the other hand, is the ground beneath your feet. To seek perfection is to chase the absence of flaw. To seek wholeness is to include everything that makes you human. Jung wrote that healing does not come from erasing what is dark or broken, but from embracing it. The goal of the psyche is not to become flawless, but complete. Perfection divides, wholeness unites. In the pursuit of perfection, the self fragments. A person polishes what can be seen and hides what cannot. They smile when sad, agree when uncertain, overperform to be accepted. Slowly, a split forms, the public face and a private ache. This split is the birthplace of exhaustion. Perfection is a kind of violence, not loud but persistent, a demand whispered by fear. Be better, be pure, be enough. It promises peace, yet delivers only distance, distance from the very soul it tries to improve. Wholeness asks for something gentler, to see even the imperfections as part of the story. He has spent years trying to fix himself. The anxiety, the doubt, the impatience. Each flaw treated like an enemy. Each emotion labeled as weakness. But one evening, sitting in the quiet after another long day of striving, he begins to notice something. The cracks that once embarrassed him are the same places where light enters. The scars that once symbolized failure are evidence of survival. Perfection seeks smoothness, but life finds beauty in texture. Even the universe, for all its symmetry, thrives on chaos. Galaxies forming from collapse, stars born out of dust. To become whole is not to shine without shadow, but to let light and dark coexist without shame. The healed person still feels pain, but no longer calls it proof of brokenness. The mature heart does not seek to eliminate contradiction. It learns to hold it gently. A life well lived is not one without mistakes, but one where mistakes have been given meaning. The river does not apologize for its bends, nor the tree for its knots. They are simply the shapes, life carved into them, irregular, yet complete. Every day offers a small act of reconciliation. Each morning, he can choose one thing about himself that he has resisted, a habit, a feeling, a memory, and sit with it, not to change it, but to understand its purpose. Maybe the procrastination once protected him from burnout. Maybe the fear of rejection once kept him safe. When he sees these parts with compassion, the war inside begins to quiet. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means peace. He can whisper to himself the mantra that ends all striving. You are not broken. You are becoming whole. The difference is subtle but profound. Brokenness demands repair. Becoming whole invites integration. Wholeness does not ask for perfection, only presence. It does not erase what hurt, but reclaims it as wisdom. And in that reclaiming, a quiet completeness emerges. Not a shining surface, but a deep, steady hum of being alive exactly as you are. The soul does not wish to be perfect. It wishes to be real. There comes a point in every inner journey when the noise begins to fade. Not because the world has grown quieter, but because the soul has. After all the storms of emotion, the questions, the resistance, something inside finally exhales. Jung described this as the moment when shadow becomes integrated, when what was feared is no longer an enemy, but a reflection. The lake of the mind, once stirred by every passing wind, begins to still. In that stillness, clarity does not shout. It simply appears, like the sky returning to a lake after the rain. For most of life, he had lived reacting to words, to looks, to silence. Every encounter was a mirror, and every reflection distorted by the ripples of unhealed pain. The more he tried to control the reflection, the rougher the water became. But understanding does not come from control, it comes from calm. When the storm of defense subsides, the mirror clears, and what he sees is not others, but himself. Not the version polished for approval, but the one that has always been there. Quiet, patient, waiting. It is a strange kind of peace, the peace that follows recognition. When he no longer runs from his darkness, others' shadows cease to frighten him. When he accepts his anger, he stops fearing confrontation. When he honors his vulnerability, he stops resenting others for exposing theirs. The same triggers that once ignited pain now dissolve into insight. The cycle of reaction turns into a rhythm of understanding. To see the mirror clearly is to realize that nothing external ever truly threatened him, only the reflections of what remained unseen within. In this space of still awareness, words become unnecessary. The mind, accustomed to explanation, reaches for analysis but finds no need. Clarity is not intellectual, it is experiential. It feels like silence after thunder or breath after weeping. Not absence, but presence. What once demanded fixing now only asks to be witnessed. He no longer interprets every glance, every tone, every shift in energy. Life is no longer a test to be passed, but a landscape to be observed. There is an old saying that water takes the shape of whatever holds it. Consciousness is the same. When turbulent, it distorts everything it touches. When still, it reflects truth effortlessly. The goal, then, is not to force stillness, but to allow it, to stop throwing stones into the lake of thought. Sometimes that means saying less. Sometimes it means saying nothing at all. He can practice this tomorrow in the smallest way. Spend one day without explaining, correcting, or performing. Speak only when words are necessary. Watch how life moves even without his commentary. How conversations breathe, how people unfold, how silence carries meaning. Observe without evaluation, as if the world were a painting slowly revealing its colors. When the mirror clears, understanding arises not through effort, but through presence. The mind does not need to solve what the heart already knows. In stillness, he discovers the truth was never hiding. It was only waiting for the waves to rest. The sky has always been reflected in the lake. It only needed the storm to pass. Love, in its purest form, is not possession or desire. It is perception. To love is to see clearly and to choose not to change what is seen. It is the rare art of presence, meeting another as they are, not as you wish them to be. Most people mistake love for merging, for molding, for saving. But true love does not demand transformation. It invites revelation. It does not say, "Be better for me," but whispers, "You are safe to be yourself here." In that safety, both people soften, and the restless need to control begins to fade. The modern heart confuses intensity for intimacy. We chase passion that burns instead of warmth that stays. We say we love, but often what we mean is, "I love the part of you that fits my story." Jung suggested that what draws us most in others are the aspects of ourselves we have forgotten. This is why relationships can feel like mirrors, reflecting not only affection, but also the unhealed corners of the soul. The person who frustrates you most may be the one showing you the truth you most need to see. Forgiveness, too, lives in this understanding. It is not an endorsement of what was done, nor an erasure of pain. It is the quiet decision to stop carrying the weight of resentment. To forgive is not to excuse, but to release, to say, I choose peace over punishment. You do not forgive because they deserve it. You forgive because you do. The moment you let go of the story of injustice, you reclaim your energy from the past. That is not weakness, it is freedom. It is the soul's declaration that pain will not be your identity. He has learned that every relationship, even the broken ones, was a teacher. The one who left taught him about attachment. The one who stayed taught him about patience. The one who hurt him taught him about boundaries. There are no wasted connections, only unintegrated lessons. Once he understands this, bitterness loses its language. He can look back on the same memories, but they no longer sting. They become what they always were, experiences of growth written in the vocabulary of love. Tonight, he can practice this understanding quietly. Take a piece of paper and write a letter of forgiveness, not to send, but to unburden. Write to the person who hurt you, or even to yourself. Speak honestly, without seeking to be right. Say what was not said, not to reopen the wound, but to close it with gentleness. When the words slow, end with gratitude, not for the pain, but for the lesson. Then fold the paper, breathe, and let it rest somewhere safe. The act is not for them. It is for the part of you still waiting to be released. Love as understanding does not fix or perfect. It sees, accepts, and allows. It says, I see your darkness and your light, and I choose not to run from either. To love this way is to understand that everything, even pain, belongs to the same dance of existence. In that awareness, relationships stop being battles for validation and become spaces of recognition. To love is to understand that nothing needs to be conquered when it has already been seen. Morning arrives without fanfare. The rain has stopped, leaving a thin mist that hangs like breath over the waking world. The air smells new, though nothing in it truly is. The trees glisten, the ground softens, and the sky begins to pale, not bright, not triumphant, simply calm. This is what rebirth feels like. Not a celebration, not a surge of energy, but a quiet return. After so long wandering through the corridors of shadow and light, the self stands whole again, not shining, but steady. Healing was never meant to be dramatic. It unfolds the way dawn does, gradual, patient, almost invisible, until you realize that darkness has already lifted. For years, he believed awakening would feel like victory, a loud redemption from pain. But now, as he looks inward, he finds something gentler. It is the peace that comes when there is nothing left to prove. The parts of himself he once fought, the weak, the fearful, the uncertain, no longer argue. They simply coexist, like clouds floating in a single sky. Integration is not the destruction of conflict. It is the recognition that conflict was always the dialogue of growth. The quiet rebirth is not about becoming someone new, but remembering who has been there all along. Beneath the masks, beneath the armor, beneath every story told for survival, there has always been a steady pulse, a truth too simple to be noticed when the world is loud. He has never been broken, only unfinished. The healing did not make him different. It made him real. When the storm within finally settled, he could see his reflection clearly again. The same face, only softer. Jung once wrote, that wholeness is not achieved by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This consciousness does not erase the past, it integrates it. Every pain becomes part of the pattern, every loss a thread woven into something complete. What remains is not perfection, but harmony. The sense that nothing needs to be resisted anymore. The silence that follows this realization is not emptiness, it is spaciousness. In it, he can finally breathe without defending, love without grasping, exist without effort. There is a subtle strength in this stillness, the kind that does not need to announce itself. He no longer seeks beginnings or endings. He lives in the gentle continuity between them. The rain will come again, the storm will return, but now he understands their rhythm. The cycle itself is sacred, dissolution and renewal, forgetting and remembering. Peace was never lost. It was only covered by noise. When the mind quiets, peace reveals itself like sunlight through thinning clouds. He stands by the window and watches the light spread across the wet earth. The world does not start over. It simply continues, softer this time. So does he. No longer rushing toward wholeness, no longer running from pain, just moving with the rhythm of what is. And in that rhythm, he recalls the simplest truth of all. Peace is not found. It is remembered. The night has passed. The first light drifts through the curtain, touching the quiet edges of the room. The air feels softer now, not because the world has changed, but because you have. Your breath moves slowly, evenly, as if your body finally trusts the silence it once feared. You have walked through the many rooms of yourself. You have seen the masks fall, one by one, until there was nothing left to protect. You have met your shadow and realized it was never the enemy. You have listened to the voice that once demanded control and found beneath it a deeper calm. Even the parts you once rejected have turned toward the light. What was separate has become whole. What was hidden has begun to breathe again. This peace is not a prize for your effort. It is not the end of the journey. It is the quiet truth that has always waited beneath the noise, the home inside you. The mind, once restless, learns to rest in what simply is. The heart, once searching, begins to recognize itself in the stillness. There's nothing left to fix, nothing left to chase, only the gentle rhythm of being alive. So now, as morning unfolds, you can let yourself rest. You do not need to become anything more. The silence you feared has become your teacher. Everything you seek outside has always lived within. And in this breath, steady, soft, and whole, you are already home.